What if the person buried under a loved one's headstone isn't who you think they are? For Margaret, a simple visit to her husband's grave turns into a shocking discovery that unravels decades of hidden secrets, forcing her to confront a past she never knew existed. Margaret stepped lightly along the winding paths of St. Mary's Cemetery, her cane tapping softly against the cobblestone as she walked. In her hand, she carried a small watering can and a bouquet of yellow tulips, David's favorite. It had been 5 years since her husband passed, and Margaret had made it her weekly ritual to visit his grave, tending the garden she planted in his memory. A peaceful solitude usually greeted her at David's resting place, but today, she found someone already there. A young boy, no older than 10, sat cross-legged beside David's headstone. His eyes were fixed on the ground, and he held a wilted daisy, turning it over in his small hands. Margaret watched him for a moment, noting the sadness in his posture, a familiar heaviness she knew all too well. Slowly, she approached him, clearing her throat gently so as not to startle him. "Hello, dear," she said softly, her voice as gentle as the breeze that stirred the flowers. The boy looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears. He didn't move or speak, just watched her with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Margaret knelt beside him, her joints protesting but her heart guiding her to his level. "I'm Margaret," she introduced herself, offering a small smile. "This is my husband David's grave. I come here every week." The boy nodded, then whispered, "I'm Ethan." He paused, then added, "I come here too, because this is where my grandma is buried." Margaret blinked, surprised. She glanced at the headstone that bore only David's name. Confusion clouded her thoughts. "Your grandmother?" she asked gently. "But this says David Mitchell." Ethan's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I know, but they told me this is where she is." He held out the wilted daisy. She loved flowers. Margaret felt a pang of empathy. She reached out and touched the boy's shoulder. "Who told you, dear?" she asked, her tone soothing and patient. Ethan wiped his nose with the back of his hand, sniffling. "My mom, but she doesn't talk about it much. Just said my grandma's resting here. Her name was Lucy. Lucy Thompson." His voice wavered, and he looked down again, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Margaret's mind raced. She had known David her whole life, and he had never mentioned a Lucy Thompson. The thought of someone else's name hidden beneath his headstone filled her with unease. But more than that, she felt an overwhelming need to help this boy, who was clearly lost in the same sea of grief she had sailed many times. "Well, Ethan," Margaret said, her voice firm with newfound resolve, "I think it's time we find out exactly what's going on here. You and your grandmother deserve to know the truth." Ethan's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope, something that had seemed almost foreign in the shadow of his sadness. Margaret squeezed his hand gently and looked at the headstone once more, her mind set on unraveling the mystery that bound them together in that quiet corner of the cemetery. They had both lost someone dear, but perhaps together they could find the answers they needed, and maybe even a little peace along the way. As they stood up to leave, Margaret glanced back at David's grave, feeling a strange mixture of love and determination. Whatever secrets lay buried, she was ready to uncover them, not just for herself, but for Ethan and his family. She had spent too long in the quiet shadows of loss. Now it was time to let the light in. And with that resolve, Margaret and Ethan walked out of the cemetery, hand in hand, ready to face whatever truths the forgotten garden might reveal. The next morning, Margaret woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She called her friend Claire, a sharp-minded woman who worked at the local archives, and explained the strange encounter with Ethan and the mystery surrounding the grave. Claire, always up for a challenge, agreed to help. They arranged to meet at the town hall later that day, eager to delve into the records and find any clues that could explain the mix-up. As Margaret and Claire sifted through the dusty files and yellowed papers in the archives, the silence was only broken by the occasional rustle of documents. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten stories. Margaret felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. She wanted answers, but she also feared what those answers might reveal about David and the life they had shared. After nearly an hour of searching, Claire pulled out a weathered envelope sealed with red wax, its edges frayed from age. "Look at this," she whispered, handing it to Margaret. The envelope was addressed to a Mrs. Thompson, and inside was a faded letter, its ink smudged but still legible enough to read. Margaret unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the words. It was from a lawyer, dated almost 30 years ago, detailing the aftermath of a tragic incident involving a woman named Lucy Thompson and a man named David Mitchell. The letter suggested a secret agreement between the families to keep certain details hidden from the public eye, A scandal involving an accident, guilt, and a promise that Lucy's name would be kept out of the official records. The letter stopped abruptly, as if the rest of the story had been lost to time. Margaret's heart pounded. Could this be why Ethan believed his grandmother was buried in David's grave? She read the letter again, hoping she had missed something, some clue that would make sense of the tangled web of past mistakes. But the answers were not there, only more questions. Ethan joined them at the archives, clutching a small photo album of his grandmother Lucy. He flipped through the pages, showing Margaret pictures of a smiling, kind-faced woman who bore a striking resemblance to Ethan. "She used to take me to the park," Ethan said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She always had stories. But then she got sick, and everything changed." Margaret studied the photos, feeling a connection to the woman she had never met. Claire, ever the pragmatist, spoke up. "If this letter is right, there's a lot more we don't know. And we can't just leave it like this." She placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll find the missing pieces. We have to." Determined, Margaret nodded. "We'll start by tracking down anyone who might remember Lucy or David from back then. There has to be someone who can fill in the gaps." Margaret and Ethan left the archives with the letter tucked safely in her bag, its words weighing heavily on her mind. As they walked through the town square, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the past was not as far away as it seemed. Ethan, sensing her unease, reached up and took her hand. "Thank you for helping me," he said softly, his eyes filled with gratitude. Margaret squeezed his hand in return, drawing strength from the boy's quiet courage. They passed by an old cafe, where Margaret spotted a group of elderly patrons gathered around a table, chatting animatedly. She wondered if any of them knew Lucy or David, if any of them held the missing pieces to the puzzle that had suddenly become so personal. She resolved to return and ask, but for now, she needed to digest what they had found. Back at home, Margaret sat by her window, staring out at the garden she and David had once tended together. The blooms seemed less vibrant now, their colors dulled by the weight of uncertainty. She thought of the letter, the secrets it hinted at, and the boy who still believed his grandmother lay beneath David's headstone. There was so much she didn't know, but one thing was clear. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. Margaret took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. Whatever it took, she would find out what really happened between Lucy and David. She owed it to Ethan, to herself, and perhaps, even to the memory of her husband. The sun dipped low in the sky as Margaret sat at her dining table, staring at David's old belongings scattered before her. She had spent the afternoon rummaging through the attic, pulling out boxes she hadn't touched since David passed. Amongst the stacks of faded photographs, letters, and mementos, she found something that made her heart skip a beat: David's diary. She hadn't known he kept one, and now, as she held the worn leather-bound book, a wave of apprehension washed over her. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the diary and began to read. The entries were a window into David's thoughts, capturing moments of joy, mundane details of daily life, and the burdens he never shared aloud. Then, as she flipped further, the tone changed. She came across a page that made her breath hitch, a confession written in David's neat, deliberate script. David described a night from nearly 30 years ago, when he had been involved in a car accident. Lucy Thompson was the passenger in his car. He had offered her a ride home after a community event, but a heavy rainstorm had made the roads slick and visibility poor. David lost control of the car on a sharp curve, and it skidded off the road, crashing into a tree. Lucy had been critically injured. The guilt of that night, he wrote, had haunted him ever since. Margaret read on, her eyes widening as David explained that Lucy didn't survive the accident. Overcome with remorse, he had promised Lucy's family that he would take care of the arrangements, a vow that extended beyond the immediate aftermath. In an attempt to atone, David arranged for Lucy to be buried in his plot, intending to quietly honor her memory. But he never anticipated that his own death would unearth the buried secret. Margaret's hands shook as she closed the diary, the weight of David's confession settling over her like a heavy fog. She sat in stunned silence, grappling with the implications. David had hidden this from her, from everyone, choosing instead to carry the burden alone. Margaret felt a rush of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. But alongside the hurt was a sliver of understanding. David's actions, however misguided, were rooted in his guilt and a desire to make things right in the only way he knew how. Ethan's face flashed in her mind, his innocent questions and the pain that mirrored her own. Margaret knew she couldn't keep this to herself. The truth had to be told, not just for Ethan, but for the memory of Lucy, who deserved to be acknowledged properly. She took a deep breath and dialed Claire's number. Claire arrived within the hour, her usual brisk demeanor softening as she saw the tears in Margaret's eyes. Margaret handed her the diary, unable to speak. Claire read in silence, her expression shifting from surprise to sympathy as she absorbed David's words. This is unbelievable," Claire said finally, closing the diary with a careful hand. "But it makes sense now. Why Ethan thought Lucy was here. Why the records were so muddled." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. "He never told me, Claire. Not a word. All these years, and he kept it buried." Claire placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll fix this, Margaret. It's not too late to set things right." Ethan and his mother, Helen, met them the next day at Margaret's house. Helen was hesitant, her eyes wary and guarded, but Ethan's presence softened her resolve. Margaret shared David's confession with them, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the revelation. Helen's expression shifted from confusion to shock, her hands trembling as she took in the truth about her mother's final resting place. Helen's voice cracked as she spoke. "All this time, I thought we had lost her completely. I didn't think anyone cared." Margaret reached out, her eyes brimming with empathy. "David cared, Helen. He tried to make amends, even if he went about it the wrong way. And now, we have a chance to honor Lucy the way she deserved." Ethan clung to his mother's side, his young face caught between understanding and the innocence of his age. Margaret knelt beside him, looking him in the eye. "We're going to make sure your grandma is remembered properly, Ethan. You deserve to know her real story." As they sat together, piecing together the fragments of a shared past, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace. The truth, painful as it was, had a way of connecting them all, across generations and mistakes, through grief and redemption. They had uncovered a hidden chapter, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild and remember, not in secrecy but in light. Determined to make things right, Margaret and Helen decided to pursue official recognition for Lucy's resting place. They contacted the cemetery administration to request the correction of the grave marker, ensuring that Lucy's name would be honored properly. However, the process wasn't straightforward. Bureaucracy, time, and old misunderstandings made their path complicated. Helen, usually reserved and distant, slowly opened up to Margaret as they worked together. She shared memories of Lucy, her love for gardening, her gentle nature, and her passion for storytelling. These conversations were bittersweet for both women, filled with laughter at remembered moments and tears for the loss they both felt so deeply. As they delved deeper into Lucy's life, they discovered more about the accident that took her life. All'epoca Helen era stata separata dalla madre ed era convinta che Lucy l'avesse abbandonata e fosse uscita dalla sua vita. The realization that Lucy had died in a tragic accident, and that David had carried the guilt all these years, shifted Helen's perspective entirely. It was as if she were seeing her mother for the first time, free from the misunderstandings that had clouded her memory. Margaret and Helen's next step was to gather support from the community. They hoped that by bringing Lucy's story to light, they could correct the record and finally lay the past to rest. Claire, with her knack for research and connections at the local paper, helped them publish an article sharing Lucy's story, David's confession, and their quest for redemption. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers reached out, offering their support and sharing their own stories of grief, forgiveness, and healing. One afternoon, as Margaret and Helen sifted through the growing stack of letters and emails from the community, Ethan sat nearby, quietly watching them work together. He had seen how Margaret and his mom had come together over the past few weeks, their shared mission drawing them closer. Gathering his courage, Ethan moved closer to Margaret, his expression sincere. "Grandma Margaret," he began softly, "it's really nice having you here with us." Margaret paused, taken aback by the unexpected title. Though not his biological grandmother, she felt a warm rush of affection for Ethan. She smiled, touched by his words, and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm grateful to be here with you, Ethan," she said. "Family isn't just about who you're born with, it's about who you choose to hold close." Just then, Ethan's face lit up as he spotted a new piece of mail in the pile. His excitement bubbled over, and he ran across the room, waving a postcard in his hand. "Mom! Grandma! Look at this!" he exclaimed. The postcard was from a woman named Beatrice, who had known Lucy in her youth. Beatrice recounted how Lucy had been an inspiration to many, always caring for those around her, even in difficult times. Helen clutched the postcard, tears welling up. I never knew how much she meant to people." Margaret placed a comforting arm around Helen's shoulders. "Your mother was loved, Helen. She was more than the mistakes and more than the accident. And now we have a chance to remember her for who she truly was." The next major step was a small ceremony at the cemetery to unveil the corrected headstone. Margaret, Helen, Ethan, and a handful of community members gathered in quiet reflection. Margaret spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of both loss and hope. David tried to make amends in his own way, but today we are here to honor Lucy properly. This isn't just about correcting a mistake, it's about acknowledging a life that touched so many. Helen stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. For so long I was angry. I thought I'd been left behind, that my mother had abandoned me. But now I understand. She didn't leave me, circumstances did. And today, I feel closer to her than ever before. Ethan placed fresh flowers at the base of the new headstone, a vibrant mix of daisies, sunflowers, and wild blooms. Grandma would have loved these, he said, his voice filled with a child's simple wisdom. He looked up at Margaret and Helen, his eyes reflecting a brightness that had been missing since their journey began. As they finished the ceremony, Helen turned to Margaret. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, but for everything. For helping us see the truth and for being here, even when it wasn't easy." Margaret squeezed Helen's hand. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Lucy's story brought us together, and in doing so, it gave us the chance to heal." They lingered at the cemetery, sharing stories of Lucy and David, remembering the joys and sorrows that had shaped their lives. Margaret looked around, seeing not just a graveyard, but a place of connection, where past and present met and where old wounds could finally begin to mend. Helen, feeling the weight of the ceremony lift, looked at the new headstone one last time. "I think she'd be proud," she said, a small smile breaking through her tears. Margaret nodded. "I know she would be." As they walked away from the cemetery, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had set out to solve a mystery, but in doing so, she had gained something far more valuable. A deeper understanding of the people she loved, and a second chance to make things right. For Ethan, for Helen, and for herself, Margaret knew that this journey was about more than just correcting a mistake. It was about embracing the full, messy, beautiful truth of their shared lives. And with each step they took, the past felt a little lighter, the present a little brighter, and the future together, a promise they were all ready to keep. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, hidden truths, and the power of family, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to Life Narratives for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories that inspire and move you. And if you think someone you know would love this tale of unexpected connections and redemption, be sure to share it with them. Your support helps us keep sharing these incredible journeys, so hit that bell icon to stay updated on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.